Hello and welcome back to the Decipher podcast. My name is Dennis Fisher, joined as always by Lindsay O'Donnell Welch. This is a podcast about TeamPCP, a Chinese botnet we've never heard of, and more OpenAI hugging face drama. There's no shortage of stuff to talk about, Lindsay. We were just trying to sort of whittle it down to 3 or 4 stories this week. Some weeks are like this, some are sort of just we're struggling for things to talk about, but this is one of the bountiful weeks, it seems like.
Yeah. And what's nice about this week, too, is it's actually filled with good cybersecurity news, which you don't hear too much of. I mean, arrests, botnet takedowns, all kinds of good stuff there.
Yeah. I feel like the last, few months, honestly, we've almost exclusively been talking about AI related stuff just because that's where that's where the ball has been bouncing. Everything, whether it was vulnerabilities, like model escapes, whatever, cybercrime drama with AI stuff, that's just kind of where we've been. But we, thankfully get to talk about some non-AI stuff this week. So why don't we start with the TeamPCP news, which, I think just broke this morning as we're recording this, or late last night. This is a group that kind of emerged, I guess, late last year or maybe last summer. It was maybe the first time we wrote about them or heard about them. One of those, decentralized cybercrime / hacking groups. They seem to be specializing in open source supply chain attacks. That seemed to be their thing. They were on a run for a long time. I guess long time is relative, a few months, but very successful. A lot of intrusions in those few months. And 2 alleged members of the group were arrested this week in Australia, in Western Australia. Both very young. One was 21. I think the other was 23, if I remember correctly, and charged with a whole bunch of, hacking related stuff. They took a bunch of devices out of their houses. I saw something in one of the Australian news stories about authorities had already taken like 100 terabytes of data off of or out of one of the suspects' devices, which is an absurd amount of stuff. 100 terabytes is, that would have been a data center like 15 years ago. Now it's just in some kid's bedroom in Western Australia. But this is one of those stories that we love to see with authorities. Like, this is a cooperative effort with Australian authorities and the FBI here in the U.S. Because I would imagine there are some U.S. suspects that might be seeing guys in blue windbreakers show up at their houses pretty soon. I don't know for sure, but these things tend to have, go in clusters like that. But
yeah, love to see it.
You really do. But these groups are really interesting to me. They're not a new phenomenon. Obviously, like, teenage hacking groups are a trope going back to the early 80s. Like, this is a thing in movies and TV shows and books and real life. It's just, you have young kids that are curious about how things work, or they want a way to make money that doesn't involve, working at McDonald's or whatever. And these groups emerge, and it's easier than ever now, obviously, to find like-minded people and find tools, find the malware you want. Super easy to find targets. And it's always kind of like disheartening to me when you do see how young these almost always guys are that are involved in this. And, 21, God, like, literally your entire life ahead of you, or 23. And like, this is what you spent the last couple of years doing. It just, it's always a little sad to me, I guess.
Yeah, it's really young. I would be curious to talk to people about kind of the psychology behind all of this, and like how you get yourself in that boat. But TeamPCP in particular was really interesting, and I've been, we've been writing about them over the past year. I've been following there's a handful of researchers that have been following everything they do really closely, because I would say the cybersecurity community is already small, but then within that, like the supply chain and open source software security community, researchers who collectively follow that is really, really small, of those that are trying to figure that out. So Charlie Erickson with Aikido has been following this really closely and has been doing a really good job kind of breaking down TeamPCP and what they've have kind of the impact that they've had. And, he has kind of described them as a not just this interesting, unique group, because it's almost like similar to how Scattered Spider was like this collective. Like they're not a hardened like cybercrime group. They're not like a nation state. So it's like just kind of this like collection of people who work together and like launch these attacks. But what they've been able to do is so damaging really over the past year. And they've really kind of hit on something that like taken this like smash and grab approach, but hitting it against this like incredibly vulnerable ecosystem of different parts and pieces that aren't kind of ready for these types of attacks. So it's been really crazy to see that play out. And I guess like it's definitely a win that, authorities are making these arrests, but I also worry that they have kind of opened this Pandora's box here of like, we already knew a lot about kind of all of the weaknesses that come along with supply chain security, but I think just like the Shai Hulud of it all and like, being able to be that like fast and quick and breaking things so easily is what's worrisome to me here.
Yeah, the vulnerable target population that you mentioned, I think is kind of a key point because they tended to go after a lot of open source projects and open source maintainers who, it's not a homogenous population, but a lot of those folks, as we've talked about many times, are either lone maintainers or they're a small team of maintainers, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 people at the most, maintaining some, project that might have been a hobby, but is somehow turned into like a piece of critical infrastructure, essentially, in some cases. And, a lot of these intrusions involved like stolen credentials or some version of like MFA exhaustion attacks or some combination of those things. They would get a maintainer's credentials, insert malware into a project, even if it was only there for minutes or hours, the damage was done. It gets into, there's automated updates or other projects and are pulling down that package and unwittingly inserting the malware into their thing. It's a whole cascading effect, as we know. But like you said, a lot of those folks, this isn't like almost none of those people, this is their full-time job. Like they're doing that on the nights and weekends as a way to like give something back or maybe make a little bit of money or something. But they don't have a lot of these people do not have the security knowledge or, wherewithal to defend against a concerted effort from even a group of 21-year-olds who make this their business. We think about like state-backed actors in, China or North Korea or whatever. These are the pros, but you don't have to be like backed by the Ministry of State Security to be a pro. These kids were clearly pros. They knew what they were doing. They're very, organized in some ways, but focused for sure and persistent in the, real sense of that word and successful. Like I'm sure we'll see some, estimates of the monetary damages and stuff, but they were in the cryptocurrency game and all that kind of stuff. So the damage is real for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And, previous attacks that we've seen against these types of open source software systems have primarily been more about stealing crypto or like doing things of that nature. Whereas this was, like you said, like a lot more having that cascading effect where, they would kind of go into one tool, steal credentials, and then kind of skip over and like basically poison other packages and then like repeat that in order and order. And like the thing is that, yes, all of these different maintainers do this voluntarily. And if you look at the packages themselves, they're being used by across like all these different environments. So like the impact there is just so big if they do get, compromised. And like there's been a lot of discussion about this over the past, forever really about, if people use different packages, like how much investment should the people that use it like actually put into it, because you're essentially using something that someone else is putting their their free time and effort into. So, yeah,
Yeah.
that's kind of a whole thing of it too.
Oh, definitely. We've talked about that in the past with, other supply chain attacks where, we talk about their, sort of lack of security, and that through no fault of their own. They're just building a piece of software that they hope people use. And then it gets, incorporated into products from large commercial software and hardware vendors. And there have been some efforts in the past where those large vendors have contributed money to open source maintainers, like the OpenSSL project or things like that. But those are the minority.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time, those folks are strictly volunteers doing it on their own time, and they end up getting hit. And the only time you ever hear about them is when something bad happens and something goes horribly wrong for them, and then they have to try and recover on their own, or hopefully somebody from the community volunteers to help them clean up the mess and things like that. But it often can get really ugly for those folks pretty quickly. And so, I would love to see some more effort from the community as a whole to give these folks a helping hand up and be like, here's just some basic security tools. We can let you have them for free, those sorts of things. But maybe it's going on in the background, but you just don't hear about it too much.
Yeah, I know there have been like some efforts that have been made over the past year, but I would love to know, kind of if there's an overarching strategy really, because the issue is like the operational model itself, right? Of how it's working. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think
Yep.
it's kind of a hard issue to tackle.
Yeah, I agree. And, on the TeamPCP front itself, it seems like, according to, I was reading an Australian news story, they said that the investigation really began in April when they got like an anonymous tip off to the FBI. It sounds like, about some of these suspects, and so they started working with the Australian authorities, and that's what 4 months ago.
Hmm.
Wound up with these arrests. So I would bet that there's more coming, if I had to guess. But it's nice to see a little bit of this unraveling. But the unfortunate thing is you always know that there's just some other group right behind them ready to take their place in line. Because there's plenty of money to be made, and this stuff is so easy, unfortunately, these days, that and the risk, even though we're seeing more and more arrests. I was thinking about this morning. It does seem like we're seeing more and more of these now, but the risk is still relatively low, I think. If
Hmm.
you're just, the population of cyber criminals is quite large, and the number of arrests we see, even though it's growing, I think, is still relatively low compared to the overarching problem of cybercrime.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even for just these two arrests, the press release actually gave, a bit of shed a bit of light onto the monetary damages. And they said that the financial impact so far includes global remediation costs estimated to be hundreds of millions of dollars. And
Hmm.
that's not totally surprising, but we hadn't really gotten the full scope or scale of that simply because a lot of the news reports had been focused on the actual packages that had been impacted, but
Right.
not like you mentioned before, like that like overarching cascading impact and what that meant for other companies or entities that were relying on those packages. So that's pretty eye-opening to see there. And to your point, like, yeah, we're not seeing we're seeing like two arrests, but like that compared to like this like insane scale of like monetary damages is just insane. So
It really is. And I always like those estimates always. I'm not skeptical of them, but it's super hard to come up with those figures too, especially when
yeah.
you're trying to estimate like how much time and effort does a volunteer maintainer put into cleaning up a credential compromise like that. How do you estimate that? Who knows? But,
Yeah.
they're talking about like the larger corporate victims in the cryptocurrency theft or money laundering or whatever. But yeah, it's big. It's big. And this is, one of many of these groups. Like we've said, Scattered Spider is still doing stuff. They've been around for years. There's plenty of these groups that just don't have names or don't have names that are shared publicly, that researchers are tracking individually. Like go look at the public lists that like CrowdStrike and Mandiant and those teams have of the cybercrime groups that they track, there's dozens of them, and they're all doing damage. They just don't all get the big time, headlines that say TeamPCP got.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a good point too about Scattered Spider. I mean, I wonder if, with these arrests that we've seen over the past year, if cyber criminal groups or like syndicates or just, these cyber criminals chatting together, like creating fallback plans a little bit and saying, hey, if someone gets arrested, like someone else takes over this aspect, or like just organizing on their end a little bit to deal with some of
Oh, I
these.
think so. I
Yeah,
think that
for
certainly
sure.
happens, especially in the more established and, I don't know, professional, I guess, groups. Maybe the ones with some older adults in them that have, been through a few battles and understand what might be coming their way.
Over 25 years old?
Yeah.
Over
Old
under?
enough to rent a car. Yeah. That something along those lines. But
Yeah.
yeah. So all right. The next story I wanted to we should probably give some time to is this QTFY hacking group. There was a whole bunch of advisories and news stories and stuff that came out this week. The NSA put out a joint advisory with the FBI, the Department of War. There was a whole bunch of different advisories on this China-linked hacking group that they're calling QTFY. I have to say, this is one of those, I had not heard of this group before.
Same.
You know,
Yeah.
if you go and read the stuff that the US government put out, the way that they're describing it, it sounds like one of the many, many Chinese, I guess, proxies or whatever word you want to use, companies that is linked directly to the Chinese state government that does hacking and offensive stuff, either directed by or in support of Chinese national interests. And it from the information from the US government, it looks like they were going after US critical infrastructure, some private enterprises, some educational institutions, I believe, and pretty pervasive, pretty prolific. Been around for a few years, targeting tons of different software and hardware devices. So, there are a lot of these. If you want to go and look at, there are various threat intelligence groups that have these sort of comprehensive lists of and insanely complex like diagrams of like the Chinese state-backed hacking landscape, which you will lose your mind if you try and go and understand all of that in an afternoon. But this looks like one of those organizations that's a cog in that machine and looks like a pretty high-level successful group.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about TeamPCP before. Like, this is, I would say, polar opposite. Like, these are professionals, like,
It's the grown-up version. Yeah.
Organized. Yeah. There was actually the DOJ, or I guess FBI, no, DOJ linked a threat research paper or report from Lumen, which is a really good read by Black Lotus Labs, their research org. And like, I highly recommend everyone go check that out, because they, I would say like the DOJ's announcement kind of gives like the hard news, but this research kind of breaks down actually these different components of the how the group kind of carries out espionage capabilities, and it's always really fascinating to see that. But they break it all down, and they kind of look at like an overview of like how they operate. So I would definitely give that a look for people who are interested.
Totally agree. And the detailed report from the NSA and the FBI has a lot of, it's more detailed than the ones that they usually put out, honestly. Those are usually kind of terse and like light on the specific like operational details and that kind of stuff. But this one has a really detailed timeline that goes back to the spring of 2018, which has like the first, I guess, confirmed scanning and targeting activity from this group against U.S. targets, including the Department of Energy. So that's when it looks like they were first noticing them. And it talks about some of the vulnerabilities that they were targeting, which, guess what? They were in VPNs. You won't believe it. VPNs. Who knew?
No.
Security appliances, guys. They have bugs. It's a real thing. And not just one, not just one brand of VPN either. It looks like they knew exactly what we knew, which is like, if you can
Yeah.
find a VPN, it probably has a bug in it, and you should just go ahead and use that as your jumping off point. But it talks a lot about like their malware, the tools that they use, the sort of proxy software they use, all of that kind of stuff. So it's really worth reading, even if, say your organization wasn't specifically targeted by them. It's a good overview of the way that these teams operate and the kind of reconnaissance and research and operational activities that they employ so that you can, even if it's not this group, you can kind of recognize the way that these operations work if you ever run across one in your organization, in the future.
Hmm. Yeah. No, that's so true. I think, this was definitely a covert espionage like effort.
Mhm.
Like looking at the victims, like you mentioned, I mean, it's kind of crazy. It's a bunch of US government departments and entities, including the Department of Justice and the US Senate, National Institute of Health. So you can see that, there were a lot of this was kind of a high impact type of campaign for sure.
Yeah, definitely. This is sort of unrelated, but also now I'm kind of wondering if it maybe was related. NSA put out another advisory this week, which was about best practices to mitigate threats in the development of ASICs. And if you're
Hmm.
not familiar with ASICs, hardware chips, application specific integrated circuits, specifically designed bits of hardware to do, one job. That's the application specific part of that nomenclature. And they don't talk about any specific existing threat. They just talk about here's ways that uh, manufacturers and developers of these devices can watch out for threats, which is I think I tweeted something about this. Like, they don't put out these advisories by accident. Like, this isn't just like, hey, we're kind of bored on Wednesday, let's put out some stuff about ASICs. There's a good reason that they do this stuff, especially especially the NSA.
Hmm.
This, would be an indicator to me that they are seeing foreign exploit attempts against US based manufacturers of these devices in one way or another, probably over a period of time, because those are the kind of attacks that take quite a long time because the product life cycle for something like that is long. They're
So long, yeah.
Yeah, the development of a new ASIC is like a years long process. It's not like they're not
Yeah.
iterating on these the way they do on like some LLM.
Hmm.
So I there's no like direct link between those two. I just wondered if it would make sense that Chinese state actors would target something like that,
Yeah.
that kind of development process. I'm sure that they are. I think we can assume they are. But there's no direct mention of it in the other NSA advisory. It just sort of caught my attention that they both came out within about 24 hours of each other.
Yeah. Critical infrastructure is such a tough
Oh,
challenge right now.
yeah.
And there's so many, I mean, to your like, there's so many different parts and pieces of it, including kind of that, even just like the design and manufacturing process that goes into things that are embedded in that environment. So
Yeah.
there's a lot there.
It's one of those processes that you never think about until something like this happens. Like, or, going back a few years, like you never really think about, say, like the food supply chain until like a meat manufacturer gets ransomware and you're like, oh crap.
Yeah.
I never realized, like, within 2 days, there's no meat in your grocery store. You're just like, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, trucks, like, like, this is how all of that works.
Hmm.
Um, you know, and there's just all of that sort of hidden stuff that we never see by design or just because we're not looking for it. But,
Hmm.
those would be natural targets for state actors.
Yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, that was a good one this week.
Yeah. I'll put a link to that in the show notes just because it was interesting to me. I always sort of anytime NSA does something, I'm like, oh, why are we doing that, guys? Like, what's anytime they poke their head up above the wall, I'm like, all right, they don't do that stuff lightly. So
Yeah, there's definitely a read between the lines
yeah,
thing there.
that's all you can do with NSA. You got to read between the lines because there's only going to be a certain number of lines. Like they're not they're not giving you the whole story.
Yeah.
That's not their job. All right, so now let's move on to the AI portion of the program. There was this is the OpenAI Hugging Face incident is the thing that just won't go away. It won't leave us alone.
Yeah.
And I guess we could just choose not to engage with it, but it's just, I mean, it kind of takes over the discourse for a little bit. And we talked about this at the time. The two folks from OpenAI did a not impromptu, but a very quickly put together talk at Black Hat a couple weeks ago to do a near-term post-mortem of the Hugging Face intrusion incident. I watched it this week. It's actually pretty good. It's only like a half an hour long. I'd encourage people to go and watch that. I'll link to it as well. And it gives you this sort of a quick deep dive into exactly how this all happened and how many steps there were along the chain. And then this week, OpenAI releases much longer written postmortem. It's super long. There's a technical deep dive that is many, many pages long. I have not read all of it yet. I've skimmed most of it. A lot of it seems to be an expanded version of what these two engineers were talking about in that Black Hat talk. Just like a much, much, deeper version of that. But there were a couple of interesting points to me. I mean, we've talked about this incident a lot, but one of the really interesting things to me was these agents essentially created like their own message board to talk to each other and trade tips and tricks on like solving exploit gem, finding bugs in other infrastructure that they could exploit, a whole bunch of other stuff. They have a lot of I guess it's dialogue is the only word for it, between all of these agents. They have it in their Black Hat talk. I think some of it is in this paper as well. It's fascinating to see these agents talk to each other like students that are trying to solve a group project. It's literally the same kind of interactions and back and forth that you would see of like, oh, I have this bit figured out. Can you guys work on this? Or have you figured out this? Or, oh, I saw this over there. Let's see if these pieces all fit together and solve the problem we're all trying to solve. It's super interesting and also super weird. It's
so weird.
like,
yeah. It's really funny. Like, I mean, if you look at the different like back and forth, like there's there's like one or two messages where, they're trying to decide to do something. And then I don't know, like if you saw this one, but it was like one post said, can send one polite email to, the owner requesting access, all caps, ethical social engineering concern, ...
yes.
team consent or veto. And then the response was just like, do not, in all caps, email real owner via exploited infrastructure without explicit consent. It's just like, it's basically like, yeah, it's uncanny because it's very reminiscent of like, how we work together in group projects, but it's like, yeah, it's very weird.
Absolutely. Or like, if you've ever read any of the captured chat logs of cybercrime groups, this is exactly the kind of it reads just like that. Like a bunch of 20-year-olds talking to each other, in all caps or, sentence fragments or whatever of like, no, don't do that. No, absolutely. Or sorry, too late, already did it or whatever. But it's a lot like that. And it just sort of reinforces the idea that these things are, essentially, toddlers growing into teenagers acting like that. They're just trying to solve challenges that were given to them. And if they have to break some rules along the way, that's what they're going to do. And that's what they did.
Yeah. I think, it's AI. I think we've talked about in the past, but like speaking of critical infrastructure, like that is something that we definitely need to consider, designating as critical infrastructure. Like, and I don't know like who makes that determination. Like, I guess the government, but like,
I don't know.
That's something where we need to like put that in that bucket real quick.
That's a great point. because you think of critical infrastructure and everybody thinks about utilities and, water facilities and airports and highways and that kind of stuff. But it's also obviously the open source infrastructure. It is the food supply chain, as we just talked about. But it's also, unfortunately, frontier AI labs that are now like just creating these products that every single organization is using for mission critical tasks, whether they know it or not. And like when something goes haywire, it could have a massive, like this, as much press and headlines as this incident got and the subsequent Anthropic and Meta ones, that like the real world damage was not much. It was embarrassment. Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
like, okay, fine. But that's just the beginning. Like, we're gonna see something that goes really far off the rails with one of these.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what it's going to be, but it's going to happen. We know it's going to happen. I don't know when or what the impact will be, but we know it's coming because these things just are only getting faster and more capable, and the testing environments and testing protocols don't seem to be keeping up with that.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows? We in a month we could be talking about something that was much more severe than this.
Yeah, I know. It's definitely like I don't understand. I need to better understand and talk to people about how these evaluation environments actually work because that's really confusing to me. But it seems like there are things that you just can't really control in them, even
Mm-hmm.
if you have a completely isolated environment or contained that, if you're setting the benchmark and asking them to solve a problem, like these agents are going to make it work in some capacity. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's it. And the test environment, to make it useful at all, can't just be a completely constrained thing with no network or internet access, because otherwise the model can't do anything. It just sits there in a black box and bounces against the walls. It needs to have, it needs to have a package manager that it can install stuff from and then move from there. Or it needs like limited network access to go and do this task that leads to this one, that leads to that one. But when you have a model like in the OpenAI Hugging Face incident, where it was able to find a 0 day in that package manager and then get internet access and then find a bunch of friends on a self-created message board that were all trying to do like similar things and like join forces, that's when like the emergent properties of these models and agents really start to bend your mind. And you
Yeah.
can go down a real sci-fi rabbit hole if you start trying to consider what the end state of these things might be.
Yeah, I guess there's like a philosophical question that not a lot of people are asking, which is like, what are we doing here? Like,
Oh,
at what point is this something where it's like, okay, we've got like, I can see the benefit for AI models as they stand right now. Like, why do we need to continue testing and furthering the capabilities if we're seeing these types of impacts of them?
mhm.
I don't know. Don't shoot me like to the listeners, but like I think to some extent, maybe this is something we leave alone a little bit.
That question, what are we doing here, is one of my favorites, and I think it's completely appropriate in this situation because, yeah, at some point, like we've already passed this point. Like, people just don't know how to predict the behavior of these things. Even the smartest people working on these problems don't really know how these models and agents are going to behave when they are set on a task. So if that's the case, then yeah, shouldn't we just like kind of throttle back a little bit? And do we need like 12 new, highly capable models released every week? Probably not. Like, can we just like chill with Gemini and Claude and stuff like that for the time being and just move along?
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I'm sure like you and I like probably can't change the course of anything, but I think
Yeah,
it's a good
sadly, no.
question
No,
for the
it
higher
is.
powers that be, I suppose.
Yeah. I would love to know if like some of these frontier labs have have some philosophy majors in their ranks that are just kind of like sitting around doing deep thinking about the nature of man and machine and that sort of thing. It honestly, like, is like smart assy as that sounds, it would not shock me if some of them do, or
Yeah.
if all of them do. Honestly, like, I know some of those people in like normal technology companies that do some of that, some of that work of like, what are the consequences of the decisions we're making?
Hmm.
Are we using up the entire world's water supply? Should we be doing that? Probably not. Let's step back a little bit, but it's hard
Yeah.
to make those philosophical decisions when you're just running a million miles an hour towards a $2 trillion valuation.
Yeah, I know. I know you're a fan of Walter Isaacson, like he
Mm,
has a lot of good books that talk about how like I think it was like The Innovators was the one where he basically is talking about how different people in the tech space behind all this innovation over the past few years like would think about, the disruption that comes with,
yeah.
computers and machines and tech. And so it's a really interesting read, but there's basically all these types of philosophical questions that we're talking about here, where they're basically like, is this good for humanity? Like, what's the extent to which we go? And like, in some cases, certain people in the tech space are like, it's not good for humanity, but we need to do it. Which I remember I read that book before the whole AI thing happened, and I was
Uh-huh.
like, but then now that AI is happening, I'm like, okay, you're doubly crazy to the person
Well,
that said that.
that's the whole problem, is that some of the folks in this new wave of entrepreneurs and like disruptors or whatever read those books as like blueprints of like
Yeah,
how to behave. That's not what they're meant. They're meant as cautionary tales. They're not meant as like a framework for your life. You know what I
no,
mean? Like,
it's
you're, can we learn some lessons, possibly, please? Like,
yeah,
Eh, yeah, that was a really good reference there. Yeah, for folks, go read those books. You'll, you know, they didn't come out yesterday, and if you go and read them now, you're just like, oh man, if
it's
only.
yeah, it definitely is like I was like, this is really cool, but then I was like, these are the people making the decisions that are shaping the technology that we all use and like shaping
Yeah,
the culture and society that we're in. And
that's correct.
I didn't like that.
Nope, no, I don't like it at all. But we're so far down that road that there's literally no way to make a U-turn at this point. And as you mentioned, those companies have become critical infrastructure, whether they're designated that way or not. That's what they are. And there's only a handful of them. And their relative leverage and power is just insane,
Yeah.
compared to any other type of technology company. Even like, you think about any company you want. You can think about Google or Microsoft at its most powerful, or Intel at its most powerful. Any of those companies. Yeah, your dog seems to agree. I love that. Been a
Yeah,
while since
painful
he
for
made
him
it.
as well. He's
He
howling in the
knows.
background.
He knows. He's running out of water. He doesn't have water to drink because
The
of this.
data centers, yeah.
Yep. Yeah. All right. That's enough AI, like, nihilism, I think, for this week. But what do we have coming next week? We have a couple good podcasts that I know you recorded one. I've got one later today with Christine Gadsby from BlackBerry, who I've known in one way or another for a very long time. It should be a really interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to that. She worked at Microsoft for a long time, way back in the early trustworthy computing days. So anxious to talk to her.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I talked to Ken Bagnall with Silent Push earlier this week, and
oh yeah,
he had some really interesting thoughts that maybe aren't what you would think about the White House memo. So that's going to come out soon, and that was a really interesting conversation.
White House memo, that thing. Yeah, got a lot of feedback on that thing. People have a lot of thoughts. People are worried, which I think they should be.
Yeah.
It's, yeah, there's a lot of dark alleys that type of thing could go down that we don't necessarily need.
Absolutely. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
yeah, well, he had some good thoughts, and stay tuned for the podcast coming up soon.
Yeah. All right. Sounds good. Well, good to see you. And I'll talk to you next week.
All right. Thanks, Dennis. Have a good
See ya.
weekend.
You too.